My mother-in-law posted a photo of me sick in bed to shame me for sleeping until noon. Days later, my husband woke me before dawn and whispered, "Honey, it's time Mom learned a lesson. You need to see this." At 4:47 inches the morning, my husband slid a key into his mother's front door, like he'd done it 100 times before. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Have you ever had an in-law cross a boundary so severe you couldn't stay silent? I am a senior forensic fraud auditor at a regional financial risk firm. My days are spent dissecting fabricated ledgers, hunting for the invisible threads of deception, and developing a profound allergy to nonsense. It is clinical, precise work that leaves no room for emotional manipulation. My husband, Derek, directs supply chain logistics. He solves complex logistical nightmares for massive corporations every single day. Yet historically, he had been strangely allergic to raising his voice about his own family, especially his mother. Evelyn was a high society matriarch of the Hudson Valley, a woman who projected an aura of flawless, unapproachable superiority. For 8 years of our marriage, she had maintained a sterile, punishing distance. We were allowed into her colonial estate exactly 9 times. She would run a manicured finger across a picture frame, lift it to the light, and emit a low, condescending hum. That hum was a weapon. It dismissed my career wins with a mock-sweet observation about how I played detective with other people's paperwork, while simultaneously snatching grocery bags from my hands so I wouldn't step past her foyer. Stepping across her rotting porch threshold that freezing October morning, I felt the heavy Hudson Valley mist settling into my bones. Looking down at the sagging, water-damaged floorboards, an uncomfortable realization washed over me. People often wonder why a hyper-competent investigator would tolerate 8 years of persistent microaggressions and boundary violations without pushing back. The truth is something much darker. It wasn't weakness. It was the exhaustion of high-functioning daughters-in-law who mistake endless endurance for marital diplomacy. I had internalized the abuse as the cost of admission to the family. It is a specific kind of institutionalized accommodation where you convince yourself that swallowing your pride is an act of love for your husband. You bear the weight of their contempt silently, believing that if you just stay quiet enough, the monster will eventually be satiated. But monsters are never satiated. The breaking point had occurred 3 days earlier. I was bedridden, suffocating under the weight of severe pneumonia with a 102-degree fever. Derek had gone to the pharmacy. At exactly 11:30 in the morning, my bedroom door slammed open. Evelyn stood there, holding our emergency key like a conquered flag. She didn't ask how I was. She simply marched to the foot of my bed, pulled out her phone, and snapped a photo of me sweaty, swollen, mouth agape, utterly incapacitated. 10 minutes later, that unvarnished image was posted to a 9,000-member regional civic club forum. Her caption read that she was wishing a good morning to everyone who actually takes care of their family instead of sleeping until noon like her daughter-in-law. The humiliation was instantaneous and absolute. By the time I could physically sit up, thousands of strangers had called me lazy, selfish, and entitled. 2 colleagues from my audit firm had already seen it. But instead of crying, begging, or screaming in a petty shouting match, my anger went ice cold. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I didn't break down. I balanced the ledger. And now, walking into her house at 4:47 in the morning while she slept upstairs, I was no longer the accommodating daughter-in-law. I was the auditor stepping into a crime scene. The inside of Evelyn's colonial estate was a breathtaking contradiction to the flawless high society image she meticulously projected to the world. We moved quietly through the freezing shadows of the hallway. The silence was heavier than the mist outside, thick with the scent of stale air and quiet desperation. On a mahogany side table sat a leaning tower of unopened mail, at least 8 inches high. My eyes scanned the top layers. There was an expired county code enforcement violation for exterior disrepair. Beneath it, half buried under outdated grocery flyers, was an urgent disconnect notice for past due utility accounts alongside a final property tax delinquency warning. I moved to the kitchen. The refrigerator was entirely empty, save for a carton of eggs and a jar of mustard. This was a woman who publicly flaunted supreme financial perfection, yet she was days away from having her basic services cut off over a few overdue bills. Derek stood perfectly still by the kitchen island, his flashlight illuminating an accordion folder left carelessly on the granite counter. He whispered for me to look at it, his voice tight with disbelief. I opened the folder, and my professional instincts immediately locked into gear. There were 5 invoices from a company called Apex Commercial Remediation, owned by a man named Vance Caldwell. The bills spanned 14 months and detailed elaborate jobs: foundation stabilization, crawlspace sealing, emergency roof mitigation. The total came to exactly $76,300. Looking at the rotting porch threshold and the sagging gutters outside, it was blatantly obvious that not a single hour of actual labor had been performed. I pulled out my phone and accessed my professional state licensing database. I typed in Vance Caldwell and Apex Commercial Remediation. 0 results. The company was completely unlicensed. Digging deeper, I ran a reverse image search on the glossy photos stapled to the roof mitigation invoice. Within seconds, the exact same water damage photo appeared on a community warning thread 3 counties over, posted 12 months prior. Then Derek pulled a half-shredded document from a kitchen drawer. It was a notice from Meridian State Bank regarding a secret home equity line of credit for $190,000. The current balance sat at $172,800. 3 monthly payments totaling $3,672 had been missed. The estate was 9 days away from public auction default. Staring at those numbers, the psychological puzzle pieces snapped together. People often ask why bullies lash out with maximum cruelty at the exact moment they are secretly failing. It is a clinical case of displaced aggression and narcissistic panic. Evelyn wasn't just a malicious mother-in-law, she was a terrified drowning victim of elder exploitation. Terrified of losing her home to a scammer and entirely stripped of her financial control, she had to manufacture a public target. By using that emergency key to photograph me sick in bed, she projected her own internal feelings of incompetence onto me. She needed a scapegoat to appear even more powerless than herself to maintain her fragile illusion of control. She wasn't running a tight ship. She was drowning in the dark, too suffocated by her own immense pride to scream for a lifeline. I stared at the bank notice in my hand, the cold reality settling over me. We weren't just dealing with a toxic mother-in-law anymore. We were standing in the middle of a massive financial crime, and the clock was rapidly ticking down to 0. We didn't confront Evelyn in the darkness of the pre-dawn morning. We waited until later that afternoon, approaching her under the guise of dropping off groceries so as not to trigger her immediate defenses. Derek attempted a gentle financial intervention. He didn't mention the $76,000 in fraudulent invoices or the impending foreclosure threat hanging over her head. He kept his voice steady, simply offering to have a discreet financial advisor review her accounts to ensure everything was optimized and secure. Her reaction was explosive. Evelyn's pristine mask shattered into hysterical rage. She screamed at us, asking if we thought she was senile, her voice climbing to a shrill pitch I had never heard before. She yelled that she did not need saving and accused Derek of trying to rob his own mother to steal her estate. She drove us out of the house, slamming the heavy oak door behind us, banishing us to the dark, freezing driveway. Standing there in the cold, Derek looked like a shattered version of the boy who had spent his whole life trying to appease her. But I didn't shed a tear. I didn't beg for her understanding. If she wanted to play war, we would play by my rules. I pivoted immediately to formal institutional channels. The next morning, I compiled a comprehensive, indisputable exploitation report. I marched directly into the Ridgefield County Sheriff's Financial Crimes Division and dropped the file on the desk of lead Detective Garrison. Detective Garrison was a seasoned investigator who took one look at my perfectly organized spreadsheets and let out a heavy sigh. He recognized Vance Caldwell and Apex Commercial instantly. He confirmed that Caldwell was an active serial predator who specifically targeted proud, isolated, high-net-worth seniors. However, until today, every victim had been too embarrassed to come forward, and nobody had possessed documentation clean enough to secure a warrant. He told me flatly that I had just handed them the kill shot. To build an airtight case, Detective Garrison immediately looped in Adult Protective Services. That afternoon, Danielle, a senior licensed clinical social worker, conducted an emergency capacity assessment under the guise of a routine senior wellness check. When Danielle returned, her clinical assessment matched my exact suspicions. She reported with a solemn expression that Evelyn was entirely cognitively sharp. She was perfectly oriented, completely competent, and ferociously protective of her independence. She was not confused. She was paralyzed by extreme, suffocating shame. The distinction was legally critical. Evelyn wasn't losing her mind. She had been systematically deceived and bled dry by a professional con artist. But because she was legally competent, the authorities couldn't just seize control of her finances to save her. We couldn't stop the bank from foreclosing on the estate, and we couldn't freeze Caldwell's assets without one crucial piece of evidence. The law required the victim's explicit cooperation. We needed Evelyn to voluntarily admit she had been played for a fool. And knowing Evelyn's pathological pride, getting her to sign a confession of her own gullibility felt like an impossible mountain to climb. The stakes had transformed entirely. It was no longer a petty family dispute over a viral photograph. It was a high-stakes legal battle against a predatory syndicate, and Evelyn was stubbornly standing on the tracks, refusing to move as the train barreled toward her. The investigation accelerated at a blistering pace. By Friday, forensic accountants had completed their trace of the stolen funds. The money trail was devastatingly clear. $68,000 of Evelyn's home equity funds had bypassed Apex Commercial entirely, flowing directly into Vance Caldwell's personal offshore shell accounts. But as the financial analysts dug deeper into the title history of the colonial estate, they unearthed a secondary twist that elevated the cruelty to a sickening new level. Caldwell hadn't simply knocked on Evelyn's door by chance. He had been meticulously tipped off. Bank records exposed a covert communication trail between Caldwell and Evelyn's own estranged high society sister. Her sister held an unresolved court judgment lien against the property, a bitter remnant of an old inheritance lawsuit that had fractured their family decades ago. Driven by jealousy and a desire to see Evelyn ruined, the sister had intentionally funneled Caldwell into Evelyn's path. The goal was calculated and merciless. She wanted to feed Evelyn into the predatory grinder, drain her equity, and force the property into bankruptcy liquidation. This would allow the sister to purchase the estate for pennies at the public auction. Evelyn's towering pride had been weaponized against her by her own blood. The clock was ticking with lethal speed. Elder law attorney Louisa Grant drafted emergency loss mitigation paperwork to halt the bank's foreclosure process. Simultaneously, Detective Garrison received intelligence that Caldwell was preparing to dissolve Apex Commercial remediation over the weekend and flee the state with the stolen funds. Detective Garrison warned us grimly that we had exactly until 9 o'clock on Monday morning. If we did not have a signed, sworn affidavit from Evelyn explicitly stating she was defrauded, he could not get a judge to sign the freezing order on Caldwell's accounts. The bank would initiate default proceedings, the money would vanish, and Caldwell would walk away free. On Saturday evening, Derek drove to the estate to make one final, desperate plea. He begged his mother to look at the evidence, to see the trap her sister had laid, and to save her own home. But Derek's lifelong habit of avoiding conflict rendered his approach too soft. Evelyn locked her deadbolts. Standing behind the heavy wooden door, she shouted that she would rather lose the estate to the bank than sign a piece of paper, admitting to the world that a stranger had made an absolute fool of her. By Sunday morning, Derek sat at our kitchen table, staring blankly at his phone, paralyzed by the same childhood fear that had always kept him silent. He was waiting for a miracle that wasn't coming. I looked at him, and then I looked at the legal documents sitting on our counter. The time for gentle diplomacy had expired. I grabbed my car keys, slid the affidavit into my briefcase, and walked out the door. The emotional actions had failed. It was time to execute the professional finish. I didn't tell Derek where I was going. I knew that if this syndicate was going to be dismantled before the Monday morning deadline, it required someone completely immune to Evelyn's emotional manipulation. It required someone who viewed the situation not as a grieving child, but as a forensic auditor holding the final piece of leverage in a high-stakes negotiation. Sunday evening, with mere hours remaining before the syndicate vanished with the family's wealth, I drove to the colonial estate alone. I walked up the driveway and knocked firmly on the heavy oak door, a door I had been barred from passing for nearly a decade. Evelyn opened it. She looked exhausted, the flawless matriarch facade finally crumbling around the edges, revealing the terrified woman beneath. She didn't hum, she didn't sneer. She simply stepped aside and let me in. It was my 10th entry in 8 years. I walked into the shadowed kitchen, placing my briefcase on the cold granite counter. I did not pull out the forensic spreadsheets. I did not mention her traitorous sister, the impending foreclosure, or call her foolish for falling for a scam. I knew that attacking a narcissist's intellect only strengthens their defensive walls. Instead, I bypassed her pride and aimed directly for her deepest wound. I told her softly, looking her dead in the eye, that I had not come to talk about the bank. I came to talk about the fever. She flinched, her gaze dropping to the floor as the weight of her actions hung between us. I continued, my voice steady and completely devoid of malice. I explained that when she posted that photo of me, when she let 9,000 strangers judge my most vulnerable, helpless moment, I felt an agonizing, suffocating shame. I felt entirely powerless, humiliated by people who had no idea what was actually happening behind closed doors. I let the silence stretch, filling the cold room. I told her I was sharing this because I thought she knew exactly how that felt. I told her I believed she had been living in that exact same terrifying humiliation for 14 months, watching a predator drain her life away while she smiled for the civic club. This is the sovereign architecture of restorative justice. The highest form of dominance over a toxic bully is not found in public ridicule or petty vengeance. It is found in unpayable, dignified mercy. By refusing to annihilate her with my superiority, I stripped her of her defensive armor entirely. I delivered an undeniable operational rescue that gave her no choice but to surrender. I slid the affidavit across the counter, along with a pen. I didn't frame it as a confession of weakness. I handed her back her agency. I told her that her sister and Vance Caldwell thought she was a weak, gullible old woman who would quietly lose her home just to save face. My tone shifted to cold steel as I reminded her that she always liked running the show. I told her to prove them wrong and be the one who puts him behind bars where he belongs. Evelyn stared at the paper for a long, agonizing moment. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. I watched her hand tremble as she reached out, resting her fingers on a silver picture frame on the counter. She didn't hum. She picked up her phone, called attorney Louisa Grant directly, and authorized the emergency legal strike. Within minutes, Louisa verified the documents remotely through an emergency video notary session, and at exactly 40 minutes past 8 that evening, Evelyn formally executed the sworn affidavit. The power dynamic of the last 8 years had been permanently, irreversibly flipped. She didn't offer a tearful apology, and I didn't ask for one. The signature on that document was her unconditional surrender. I packed the affidavit into my briefcase, the crisp sound of the latch echoing like a gavel striking wood. I walked out the front door, leaving Evelyn standing alone in the kitchen, finally facing the reality of her own salvation. At exactly 9 o'clock on Monday morning, the trap snapped shut. Detective Garrison and the county prosecutor executed the emergency freezing order on Vance Caldwell's personal and shell accounts just as the predator was attempting to wire the funds offshore. Caldwell was arrested in the parking lot of his fake remediation firm and indicted on multiple felony counts of grand theft and elder financial exploitation. The forensic evidence we provided triggered an avalanche. Within days, 5 other victimized families came forward. The court ultimately ordered full restitution of $285,200 across all the regional households. Meridian State Bank, presented with the frozen assets and the criminal indictment, immediately halted the foreclosure auction and approved the loss mitigation protocol. The colonial estate was safe. 3 weeks later, an investigative journalist ran a massive expose in the regional press detailing the entire syndicate and the sisters' vicious betrayal. The article never named Evelyn, but it explicitly named the scheme and its scope. The 9,000 members of that civic club forum, the exact same people who had typed insulting comments under my fever photo, suddenly connected the dots on their own. The public narrative reversed completely. The following morning, Evelyn posted a retraction to that exact same forum. It was 4 sentences long, entirely devoid of excuses. She wrote that she had posted something about her daughter-in-law recently that she was deeply ashamed of. She admitted she took out her private panic on the person who least deserved it. She confessed she was drowning and that I had saved her life. She ended it with a simple apology to me. She didn't tag me. She never brought it up to my face. But a month later, when I caught a minor, entirely forgettable seasonal cold, I heard a knock at our door. I opened it to find Evelyn standing on our porch unannounced. She wasn't holding a key. She was holding a container of homemade chicken soup. She didn't critique my appearance or hum condescendingly. She just handed me the container, said that I looked exhausted and needed to eat something, and then walked back to her car. It wasn't a miraculous redemption. It was the awkward, silent submission of a defeated bully who finally understood exactly who held the moral and operational authority in the family. I've come to realize that true vindication is never found in screaming matches or petty retaliation. Narcissistic aggression is almost always a mask for profound, suffocating shame. When toxic family members lash out, they are usually drowning in their own secret failures. By maintaining your emotional sovereignty, by refusing to get loud and choosing instead to get ruthlessly competent, you render their attacks powerless. Forgiveness isn't always about repairing the relationship for the other person. Sometimes it's about establishing an unshakable boundary that sets you entirely free. I didn't just save my mother-in-law's estate. I evicted her disrespect from my life forever. Have you ever had to use radical competence to shut down a toxic family member? Drop your story in the comments below, hit that subscribe button, and share this with anyone who needs a reminder that their peace is worth fighting for.